Hi, this is Bob Healy, Executive Vice President with Evolve IP, and thank you for joining our webinar series, Ransomware is Dead, Why Recovery is the Best Prevention. In the presentation, we're going to discuss an update on the ransomware epidemic. We're going to talk about security challenges. We're going to discuss where cloud solutions fit for best practices, and then we'll also review some use cases. For the bad guys, unfortunately, ransomware is A, an easy business to get into, B, provides immediate payout, and C, offers an ongoing revenue stream. For the purpose of today's discussion, we're going to assume there's familiarity with the deep web and maybe even with the dark web. Right? So you have the visible surface web where most activity happens on the World Wide Web. But then you also have the deep web. Right? And the deep web is estimated to be about 500 times larger than the visible surface web. Within the deep web, though, is the dark web, which is the portion of the deep web where a lot of criminal activity happens anonymously. And the dark web in May of 2015 was added to the dictionary, in some ways providing some validity to its reality. Some quick facts about ransomware, right? So Gartner estimates about 2.5 million successful ransomware attacks last year. They also estimate that the frequency will double over the next few years. Trend Micro surveys that 53% of companies have been a victim. It's even higher in the healthcare industry, and 60% of those surveyed say that employees are their biggest risk. And that's a theme that we're going to reiterate and hear more about as this presentation moves on. And last year there was over $1 billion of payments made. We conducted a very comprehensive study in the healthcare industry with a firm called ID Agent. And what they do is they monitor the deep dark web for email vulnerabilities and credentials available for sale by the bad guys. What we found was of all the vulnerabilities and credentials for sale, 76% of them had passwords associated with them. In a separate study, ID Agent also found that 75% of people will either recycle or use a variation of the same password across multiple systems and multiple websites. So with all the credentials for sale on the deep dark web, very often passwords are associated with them and people use the same or similar passwords across multiple systems. Another study was conducted by an organization, Digital Citizens Alliance, and it was focused on the .edu domains. And what they found was there was over 14 million credentials available on the dark web. Right? And they published the domains and how many compromises or vulnerabilities that were there. So the key point here is this information is not secret. It is out there and available by the bad guys. If you remember back to 2012, LinkedIn announced a data breach. 6.5 million encrypted passwords were posted. And then 4 years later, there was an announcement of an additional 117 million vulnerabilities that were posted. Now, though those passwords may have been encrypted, there's publicly available websites that allow you to de-encrypt passwords, and often these encryption keys become available years after the original vulnerability. And coming from their blog when all this happened, they stated, you see in that last bullet point there, that they began to invalidate passwords that had not been updated or changed since that breach. So what you see here is a pattern. People are the biggest area of susceptibility. Passwords are available for sale, and people use similar passwords across multiple sites. If you go back to the last slide just for a moment, right? So there was a breach on a social site. People use very similar passwords or recycle their passwords, and then what the bad guys do is they just run algorithms at the speed of light in order to try and gain access to different systems or different networks, right? So no wonder that compromised credentials was the #1 area of data breach in 2015, right? So how do you stop someone with valid but stolen credentials from getting into your network? Right, so the overarching question is really, can you prevent ransomware? We've talked a lot about people being the biggest area of susceptibility, right? And human error comes into play as well, right? Phishing scams, they play on people's inherent flaws, right? So everyone's familiar with the Google email, with the Google Doc scam most recently, right? And the dark web was being discussed on broadcast news, right? And during the election season last year, there's a lot of news reporting that the DNC hack was not a very sophisticated measure, rather it was simply a phishing scam, right? So employees and people are your largest area of susceptibility, and scams, unfortunately, are everywhere in life. We've talked a lot about the theme of people being susceptible in this presentation, right? And some of the quotes that you see here reiterate that, right? So half of all breaches are the result of insecure employee behavior. Even trained staff, close to a third of them will open a phished email within an hour, right? And the bad guys are targeting smaller and smaller companies because they're less sophisticated. And according to the former FBI Director Robert Mueller, everyone will be hacked at some point. We talked about on an earlier slide in the presentation how the number of ransomware attacks are expected to double over the next few years, right? And if you think about the high volume of vulnerabilities and credentials that are available, if you think about the high percent of people that use similar passwords across multiple sites, no wonder ransomware was going to double, and it's exponentially increased over the last few years, right? It's very difficult to keep ransomware out of your network when bad guys have what looks to be valid credentials. So we used the phrase "no broken glass found," right? So it's very easy to detect when someone breaks your window on your door and tries to come into your house, right? But when someone seems like they have valid credentials, that's very difficult to prevent, right? Stolen credentials are the easiest path in, people are your biggest risk, and attacks are doubling, and they're targeting smaller firms, right? So can you truly prevent ransomware or an attack? That is the question. Can you? Earlier we showed a quote from the FBI, which in essence said everybody will be hacked at some point, right? The other things that the FBI says, as a best practice for protection are you need to back your data up regularly, you need to frequently verify the integrity of those backups, you need to secure those backups, but most importantly, you need to isolate those backups from the computers and the networks in which they protect. That's the key. You need to have isolation so you can recover when ransomware or other attacks happen. So following through on that theme from the FBI, right? In addition to what they say, you obviously need to have proactive threat intelligence. Active security management is critical, right? But most important, you need to have a very strong reactive posture. You need to be able to recover, right? So you need to have the secure offsite backup and replicated data. You need to have the ability to recover that data from multiple points in time, and you need to have a plan that guarantees you continuity, right? That's because nobody can 100% prevent ransomware 100% of the time. We need to be able to recover from it. As part of that strong reactive posture, right, we have this continuum that you see on the slide here, right? So as you work left to right, what you end up with is the more you are moving your data, both backup and replication, off-site into a cloud with recoverable servers, the more you are increasing your survivability and the more recoverability that you have. If you think about that prior slide, right, the more you move from left to right, the more recoverability and survivability that you had, right? At the end of the day, that's what's most important. Can I recover and can my users access the data, right? So the more you need to have that window be less than 4 hours, right? That recovery time objective is less than 4 hours. The more you need to have the right side of that continuum with services that are backed up and replicated in a cloud off of your premises with recoverable servers that are easily accessible by your users. So again, let's talk about best practices, right? So you need to have in-production data center backups, a copy of those backups off-site at an alternate data center, cloud or not, replication of your data in an off-site location, and have multiple points of recovery, because you may need to go back 2 to 3 days to find the right point in time that you have to recover from, right? A clean copy of your data. You also need to have recoverable servers available to you in that off-site data center, and if compliance is a consideration, you need to ensure that that data center, whether it's cloud or premises-based, has compliance consideration. And most important, your users need to have the ability to access those servers, right? So when you do all of this, you truly do make recovering from ransomware or other attacks, human error or infrastructure failures, a very manageable event, and in essence make ransomware dead. This slide here is a pictorial view of what we talked about in the last slide as far as best practices, right? So top right hand corner would be your primary data center, and in the bottom what you see there is office users and remote access. Now that primary data center might be in your headquarters, but for pictorial purposes, it's off-site there, right? So you have your production servers on your primary data center. You have the storage, obviously, and then in data center backup for quick file restores. What you then need to do is make sure you have a copy of those backups in an off-site location, potentially a cloud environment, along with replication of that data. And again, most important is recoverable servers in that environment, along with the ability to access those servers, right? That work needs to be done before an incident happens. Okay, so let's talk about a few use cases here, right? So a ransomware attack where ransomware is alive, right? So, if a ransomware attack happens in an environment with a combination of tape and low-end cloud backup, but no cloud or off-site server infrastructure to recover to, right? In that scenario, the customer was able to restore their files on their premises, 5-6 files at a time, and it took them about 7 days to be partially operational and 14 days before they were fully operational, right? So now the real question is that acceptable? Is that an appropriate means of recovery? 7 days for partial and 2 weeks for full. This next situation looks at a scenario where half of the data was, as we described earlier in the presentation, right, and the other half was very similar to what was on the last slide there, right? So when there was a corruption of the SAN, which caused them to lose access to their data, within 2 hours, the data that was replicated and available on recoverable servers in the cloud was accessible to the end users. The remainder of the data was only 75% restored after 2 weeks. So again, if you think about the last two scenarios, the data that was replicated and backed up in the cloud with servers available to recover to is almost instantly available to the end users. This third scenario here was a compromise via an email account, which we've talked about several times today, about people being the biggest area of vulnerability, right? And all of the data was, as we discussed, replicated in the cloud with available servers to recover to, right? In that scenario, though, the customer was able to restore all of their data within 90 minutes. And they were able to find the most appropriate point in time to recover to, right? So there was maximum data recovery with minimal business interruption, and end users were able to access the data within an hour and a half. In summary, let's just talk about a few of the themes that we discussed here in the presentation, right? So people are our biggest area of susceptibility, credentials are available, and we cannot 100% of the time prevent ransomware, right? So we need to have a proactive threat intelligence, we need to actively manage that security, but we need to have a very strong reactive posture. We need to be able to recover. No broken glass found, right? How do you stop someone with what looks like valid credentials from entering your network? Ransomware is dead. It is a very manageable event when your data is easily recoverable from multiple points in time and your users can access it in very short order. Thank you for joining our webinar today. This is Bob Healy with Evolve IP.